Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up and coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. And in my humble opinion, You, Me, and Tuscany fucking sucks. And I don't mean that in a it's just kind of a mediocre rom-com way. I mean in a embarrassing levels of both humorlessness and technical incompetence bad kind of way. I mean, already terrible cinematography where the lighting and color timing between shots doesn't match sort of bad kind of way. I mean, a character is having a conversation and leans out of focus for a really important heart-to-heart line read kind of bad. I mean, also, it's just astoundingly racist bad, as in literally every other black woman who isn't Halle Bailey who has a speaking role is portraying some kind of sassy, jaw-jacking, vulgar stereotype bad. Sucks! This movie sucks. But fortunately, I can spare us all a new movie rant for the time being, because on the same night that I dared to support You, Me, and Tuscany, I also saw Exit 8, an official adaptation of the indie adventure game of the same name, directed and co-written by seasoned film producer Genki Kawamura, which stars Kazunare Ninomiya as an unnamed protagonist and asthmatic, alienated gig economy working 30-something who, while making a routine commute on the subway, finds himself trapped in a surreal liminal dimension in which the sterile, fluorescent pedestrian tunnels take on the form of a seemingly inescapable and increasingly unstable loop. Ninomiya's character, referred to only as the Lost Man, forced to repeat the same trek over and over again. In a faithful adaptation of the original video game's mechanics, the Lost Man's only clues to escaping this haunting realm are a set of four instructions posted at the direction signs. He has to proceed in the direction of the sign, pay close attention to the details of the hallways, and turn back if he notices or is rather horrified by the shocking revelation of increasingly elaborate anomalies in the otherwise repetitive reality of the tunnels. Everything from doors to lockers to advertisements, etc. If he notices any anomalies, he's supposed to double back, and only in this way does he have any hope of finally reaching his destination, the titular Exit 8. Which is all to say that while Kawamura and co-writer Hirase Kentaro do frame their adaptation within a dramatic psychological narrative, one dealing with the lost man's struggles adjusting to the sudden news of getting an estranged ex pregnant, how that relates to his own experiences of paternal absence, it's perhaps more accurate and honestly more respectful to Kawamura as a filmmaker to say that it is this real dramatic story that is not the larger context, but rather exactly the part of the production that is being framed by its identity as a game adaptation. Exit 8 isn't exactly the first horror or even fantasy genre film in general to involve characters going on horrific or dangerous journeys bounded within the context of some kind of game or sport. But it certainly feels exceptional because as an adaptation of a video game, the continuity between the very basic mechanics of the game and the spectacle of the film effectively makes Exit 8 far more about games and gaming than, for lack of a better term, its dramatic core. I actually think Kawamura and Kentaro have written a fairly compelling story here about an alienated millennial whose surreal journey inevitably overlaps with his various insecurities and fears and inner struggles with feeling powerless or irresponsible, or at least Kawamura directs it very well. It's not astoundingly original material, horror movie or not, but the choice to focus on such a limited cast to structure so much of the film simply around following individuals through an environment that almost never changes, even when relying on long takes. Kawamura and cinematographer Keisuke Imamura are not trying to show off. It's not only not gratuitous use of long takes, but rather gives the spectacle of the film a naturalistic anchor, where it's not about how much they can do with a long take, but actually the opposite. The cinematography gets more diverse as more characters are introduced and the spectacle ramps ramps up, but from the beginning, Kawamura utilizes long takes in order to emphasize how little is occurring in both senses of the term, how little there is going on in any individual frame, but also, therefore, how much is going on in terms of Ninomiya's performance, in terms of the sorts of small, anomalous details that we sometimes notice long before the Lost Man does. Exit 8 may not be exceptional in terms of its content, whether viewed as a psychological drama or as a psychological horror, but it proves effective at such a small scale because of its willingness to build upon a foundation of minimalism, a foundation that forces us intuitively to not just watch Exit 8 as something like a common complaint about a lot of bigger budget fantasy films and game adaptations in particular, which is basically like you're being forced to watch somebody else play a game. Rather, Exit 8 invites us very persuasively to view those small details, even the uncomfortable stretches of time in which virtually nothing is happening, in the way that the person playing the game, both the game itself and the game within the film, is also doing. But that brings me back around again, because yes, in my humble opinion, Exit 8 is tolerable enough on its own, if not very original as an example of psychological horror, but it's when you recognize how self-conscious it is as a video game movie. It proves much more interesting as a narrative about games, about gaming. Exit 8 doesn't suffer from the feeling of watching somebody else play a video game because Kawamura maximizes the association between the game and the film as an adaptation of not just the game's superficial content, but the fact that it is a game where, through voyeurism and dramatic irony, we are playing our own game with the film, which is really just to say that Kawamura has figured out something that video game film adaptations should have figured out a long time ago, which is that the template for these sorts of adaptations shouldn't be action, adventure, and fantasy, but like mystery and procedurals, or gimmicks like first-person cinematography or 3D. Cinema already has a non-exclusive subset of films straddling all kinds of genres and forms, where the whole appeal of it is that it replicates the feeling of a game, of an active form of spectatorship that is unique when contrasted with the passive consumption of most film narratives at an emotional level. By that same token, because Kawamura's intuition has led him to naturally make his video game adaptation a movie about a game, I think both indie game fans and cinephiles alike will find a quintessential example of a run-of-the-mill psychological horror movie that ends up saying much more with much less stylistic chauvinism or on-the-nose metaphor about its dramatic subject, this trapped, alienated millennial who is necessarily undergoing an experience that is not really metaphorical of his inner trauma, but metaphorical of what else? Gaming. Video games themselves. Exit 8 treads quite a deft artistic line because, despite being a video game adaptation, it is a video game movie that never once explicitly says that it's a movie about video games. But it doesn't have to. It just progressively weighs on you as you are watching this trapped, alienated character stuck in this loop of grinding these game levels over and over again, that this is a movie about gaming, and more critically, about gaming as a social phenomenon, how gaming is interlinked with our own traps, our own alienation. Exit 8 isn't just a video game adaptation with pretenses of being about just another belabored self-help or mental health subject. It's a visceral horror film about something just as tangible, which is to say, it's far less about the lost man's struggles with paternal legitimacy, and far more about gaming addiction. Video games as this spectral entity that have absorbed so many of the adrift millennials, like the Lost Man, have become their sole purpose for being in the absence of anything tethering them to a society or intimate relationships or hope for the future. And yes, as the film goes on, one of the stakes of the narrative is the extent to which some characters in a similar position to the Lost Man end up simply desperately chasing catharsis and not actual release from the game, not an actual point where the game finally ends, where you've beaten it, where you can move on back into the real world. Despite how horrifying it is, the movie portends that there is something about this world that is alluring, secure in its constant repetition, secure in its constant vindication of the navel-gazing self and your own struggles, where the only goal is to just play the levels over and over again. You will always win more often than you will lose. You will always spot anomalies and double back the right way more often than you will lose at a specific level. You can just do this over and over again. Exit 8 is exactly the kind of small genre movie that I often worry is in danger of being written off or underrated when there's some really subtle, sophisticated work going on here at quite a small scale, both in terms of its cinematic technique and in terms of that layering of themes, that collapsing of the distinction between itself as a game movie and a movie about games, about how they become such a strangely ambivalent phenomenon in our culture, defined just as much by their association with alienation, sloth, frustration, anger, addiction, as they are with what remains the guile of both the game and the gaming film, which is the simple joy of playing into it, even one with a dark or horrific premise, the catharsis of that gaming. I found it largely tense and effective as a psychological horror, but much more engaging and refreshing as that kind of middlebrow art house genre movie that leads with limitation and understatement, that allows you to discover its themes for yourself, to play the game of reading the film. I'm giving it a 3.5 out of 5. With that, I'm getting out of here. Thank you so much for sticking through this whole video, and please don't be a stranger to shouting out in the comments, what did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the New Movie Diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.